It is not, I wish it were, but it is not as easy as just getting a bunch of passionate people and sending them out to do their thing.
4 to maybe 6 weeks into our relationship, he got killed. And it fucked me up, right? I felt like I had failed him.
Our job in CVI is to build trust, give unconditional love, and do the best that we can. And we'll save a lot. We're not going to save all of them.
Welcome to The Incredible Messenger, a blend of real-world stories, expert insights, and proven strategies that keep our families, communities, and cities safe and healthy. Moving beyond rhetoric and politics to practical solutions and community safety, here's your host, Jonathan McMillan.
Hey, welcome back to the Incredible Messenger podcast. It's your guy, Jonathan McMillan, the host of the show. This season is shaping up to be fire, y'all. I have had a lot of just really wise people who I respect, admire. Many of them I would consider friends. And today is no exception. This is a gentleman who, like a few of our other guests, we first connected on LinkedIn. Soren has a very strong background in CVI. He's been a part of some of the biggest CVI programs in the country, Ready Chicago. He's trained hundreds and hundreds of both community workers and law enforcement, the concepts, principles, and practices of CVI, and giving technical assistance, strategic blueprints, and help determine what makes a program, moves a program from being theoretical to actually effective. So, Soren, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you on the show.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Going back to what you said about developing professionals and investing in the field, like we've barely scratched the surface, in my opinion, of how to effectively reduce violence in communities. I think we have some excellent methods. We have an amazing workforce, and we're doing the work, and we see that in the national numbers. But if you fast forward the tape 10, 20, 50 years, we're going to keep building on that. We're going to develop new methods, get even better at, figuring out exactly what skills and support people need. And I believe we're building a community-based safety infrastructure that is going to have even better results in the future, right? And to get there, I think we need people like you who don't stop at, oh, we got this model, cool, let's implement it, but are constantly trying to make the models better, figure out what the next model is, and just always level up.
I appreciate that. Thank you, sir. Soren, I would love to hear what was the catalyst for you to get into the work, and then we'll talk more about what the work in your career has looked like along the way.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. There's a couple of distinct events that led to me being in community violence intervention. The first is really in my first direct service role. I was working in a locked treatment facility for young people who had experienced a lot of trauma. We were the facility that young people came to after they had gotten kicked out of everything. Our average young person had 14 or 15 placements, be that foster care, group homes, et cetera. And then we would not kick them out for any reason, right? So that meant that we were dealing with a lot of trauma related behavior, a lot of physical assault. I got, punched and spat on and everything in that role. And that was really foundational to learn how do you keep people safe, even if they're trying to punch you, and show unconditional care to them. And I was there for a year. And there's two things that I want to say about that. One is just seeing the power of relationships and how it can take time to build those relationships. There were young people who came in who absolutely could not stand me on day one because I was very consistent about the rules. But the reason I was very consistent about the rules is because I wanted to create a predictable environment for them so that they could feel safe, right? And that actually worked. And over time, I remember one young man who we were doing a circle, right? Not just a normal interaction. It's like a structured circle where we're practicing communication, relationship building skills. And he stood up in the middle of the circle. He was like, get this dude away from me. I can't stand him. And then a year later, when I announced to the young people I was leaving, he was like, what? Why are all my favorite staff leaving? And that's not because I'm amazing at direct service. That's because I applied techniques. I was consistent. I showed, integrity and authenticity, and I really cared about him. And he saw that me caring about him was a lot more valuable than me letting him get away with some, minor rule violation. So I learned a lot in that year. And unfortunately, one of the young men that I worked with there ended up getting discharged. And shortly after he was discharged, he got shot and killed. And it's not that that experience instantly propelled me into community violence intervention, but it planted a very big seed. And I think because, I grew up isolated from violence, I had to learn the dynamics and the drivers of violence through the work that I've done. And if I had just read about this young man in the newspaper, I would not have understood his story. But because I worked with him for almost a year and I understood the trauma he had experienced and how this pointless event came to be, it just planted something in me. And so I'll fast forward a little bit. I've, worked with hundreds, if not thousands of people, direct service roles. And I think that's something that gives me it really anchors me because I do more administrative work now. And in those direct service roles, I really came to believe that everything people do, they're doing for a reason. It makes sense for them. They have a way of navigating the world that they have developed based on the world that they grew up in. And it has helped them survive to this point. And sometimes that way of navigating the world might involve acts of harm or acts of violence, right? But we have to understand where the behavior comes from, what it's doing for somebody. And it's not helpful to try to squash that or stifle that. We have to understand the need that they're trying to meet, right? Oftentimes folks want to be connected, want to be safe, want to pursue opportunities, right? And if there's no other viable way for them to pursue those things, then it's hard to reduce behavior that could be risky or harmful, right? So through all those experiences, I came to believe that, we are very much products of our environment. And I look at the environment that I grew up in, which was relatively stable. I feel grateful for that, but I also feel like that stability in some ways came at the expense of other environments people are growing up in that are not stable. And I truly believe that, if I grew up in the same conditions as the people who are participating in CVI programs, I'll be doing the exact same things, right? Because it's not any type of particular part. It's just human behavior. This is how human beings respond to the environmental conditions that create the risk for violence. And I don't want to live in a world where, you roll the dice when you're born and then your zip code is your destiny. That's garbage. I want to live in a world where all people are safe, all people have safe connection to each other, and people have opportunities. And we don't live in that world. And so I began to see that, and I'll bring this full circle now. It was about 2014 or 2015, I actually watched the documentary, The Interrupters, which I'm sure you and many of your listeners have seen. And I was like, damn, that is the real work. I had never seen anything like that before. I was very into, harm reduction and meeting people where they're at and just whatever it takes to do the work. But I had never seen such brave and committed people doing the work in a way that is just so on the ground and so willing to do whatever it takes. And so that was the moment that I was like, I really want to move into CVI. And of course, we weren't calling it CVI back in 2014, 2015, but that's what it was. So, in the time I was actually working in refugee resettlement in Chicago, and I didn't know how to pivot into this field. So I ended up going to grad school. And it was in grad school that I met Eddie Bocanegra, who would become a friend and a mentor. And it was through Eddie that I then got pulled into Ready Chicago. And that's kind of like how it all began for me.
Let's talk about your work after leaving that detention center, working with Eddie and Ready. What were some of the things that you learned while working at Ready that you have now taken to say, okay, these are best practice, these are the things that are effective? And what are some of those skills, those technical pieces that I would say many CVI people who are ambitious to be a part of CVI that they miss?
I mean, I learned Ready was like the most challenging and meaningful thing that I have ever done. And it tested me every day. And I learned a lot from it. But I'll zoom in on a couple of things. One, first and foremost, relationships are everything. And anything we want to do, we just have to start with connecting and building trust with each other. Whether that's like me in a training role, like people knowing who I am, having seen me around and maybe sitting down to do one-on-ones with them, right? Or me and the admin team, like having to have difficult conversations about how do we want to make a change to the program or something like that? Like whatever level it's at, if you don't have a foundation of a trusting relationship, you're not going to get anywhere, especially in a field like community violence intervention, which has had to protect itself quite a bit in order to get to where it is now. And obviously, it still has to protect itself from constant attacks. So there's I don't want to say suspicion, but there's a need that everybody in the field has to vet each other and figure out, is this person really about the work or do they have another agenda? Because there have been so many people who had other agendas who have come through the space. So I think building that foundation is first and foremost. But I know your question is really more about the technicality of the work. I think I want to acknowledge that we're operating in an environment without enough resources. And the issue that we're trying to solve could not be more serious. It is literally life and death. And that creates a work environment where it is extremely hard to slow down, plan, train, build. We have, like I said before, I think the most amazing workforce who is literally putting their lives on the line to do what they believe in and create safety and community, and have so much admiration for the sacrifice and the passion, the talent that goes into this work. And it's critical, I think, to carve that time out, to slow down, to plan, to build, to train. In my mind, to answer your question, I want to zoom out a little bit and just say, if we want to really reduce violence, there is a sequence of steps that needs to take place, right? First is we have to understand what's driving violence, right? Who is most impacted? Where is violence happening? And what types of events are preceding a shooting? If we know those things, we can then figure out what type of intervention is going to make the most sense, right? But just selecting the intervention obviously is not the end of the journey. We have to then actually build it out, right? So we might have a theory of change that says like, okay, we understand these dynamics, so we're going to do this. We think that's going to lead to this. But that middle part, that intervention, we have to flesh that out with things like, program manuals and policies and procedures and trainings, right? And then we need to invest in the organizations that are actually delivering the intervention to make sure that they have resources, training, right staff, everything that they need to do that really well. And I think that is a step that we sort of rush through, right? We get grants out the door, and there's sometimes as little $75,000 here for grassroots CVI organization to do what with? I don't hire half a FTE. So we need the resources. But then what's happening in that middle step, right? I've seen firsthand through Ready Chicago how much work it takes from everybody involved to consistently deliver a quality intervention. It is not, I wish it were, but it is not as easy as just getting a bunch of passionate people and sending them out to do their thing, right? It takes a lot of training and debriefing and reflecting and checking in on how things are going, looking at data, right? And that's not to say that people aren't doing their jobs. This work is hard and all of us need to improve every day because that's what the field deserves. And it's just so complicated that so many things can go wrong, even though everybody is doing a good job and doing their best, right? So we have to have some type of approach to regularly reviewing data, but not just looking at a dashboard without any context, right? Whoever is on that admin team and looking at that dashboard, they also need to be boots on the ground, right? They need to have perspective from the people who are actually doing the work to be able to arrive at accurate conclusions about why things are going the way that they're going, right? And so I just want to call back to what I said earlier. I think that the field of CVI has had to protect itself and has done a decent job over the years of protecting itself. But one of the consequences of that sort of isolationist mindset is resistance to what I'm talking about, right? And, and I'm not advocating for outsiders coming in and monitoring programs that they don't understand and then, taking funding away because they didn't see what they thought they should see, but they don't understand the work. But within the field, amongst trusted leaders, that I think the type of rigor that needs to be applied to CVI programs, both in the planning stage of really building things out and laying out clearly in policies, what does this intervention entail? And if we have an assessment that we're going to use to identify barriers that people are struggling with, then every single participant should receive that assessment. And if that assessment is showing that a majority of participants are experiencing unstable housing or have no dental care, then we should be seeing connections to those services, right? And oftentimes we're moving so fast in the work that we may not see that there's a pattern of housing instability or, mental health or substance use related needs, right? And so we're piecemealing it and we're sort of putting out fires, but we're not always responding as effectively as we can.
Yeah, that was a fantastic answer because you touched on so many different elements that people miss broadly, from those who are in the field, from those who are running programs, to those who are funding programs, whether that's philanthropy or government systems. They're missing what I would say the nuance of models, whatever the models are, whether it's advanced peace, it's ready, it's cure violence, becoming the man. There's so many models out here that we know are effective because they're evidence based, and it's not just as simple as saying we're going to use the Chicago model, the Boston model, the Baltimore model, or any of the names that look as I talk right now. Like I have the advanced piece right here. Shout out Devon. This is great. I love Devon putting this out here and like some of the messaging about like what CVI is. And I also fear that a city manager is going to pick up this book and say, we can do that in our city without doing all of the groundwork that you talked about, right? A couple other things that I heard in your response, pushback, work with me if I got this wrong. One of the things I've heard, and I have said this often, is that the work happens at the speed of trust, right? From the relationship that I had with Shamar, the trust that had to be established, I would have never, ever been effective with him. It's argumentative whether I was or not, because I'm dying. but the relationship was bonded there because we worked. I was able to establish trust, and he trusted me in all of those things, right? So that's a very ground level. But there also needs to be trust from between the system, or well, I would say the community-based organizations who are leading this work, and be able to trust that the system is going to support this work.
Yes.
So whether that's through consistent funding, long-term funding, a commitment to funding, that they're going to get invoices paid. I know you have spoken in the past about some of the things between systems and community-based partners that erodes that trust and then makes the work so much difficult, makes developing trust between the community-based partners and the participants difficult. Can you talk something about that?
Yeah. I mean, what you said there really resonates. And for listeners who don't know, I spent a year in the Washington state government and kind of struggled with these dynamics while I was there. I think it's a building trust, whether it's government or philanthropy, with across government and philanthropy, along with, community members and community-based organizations. We're at a disadvantage out the gate, right? Because there's a harmful legacy that we all kind of like step into, right? So there's mistrust from community-based organizations towards government and philanthropy, and that mistrust is earned. And it's almost like there's an analogy here between those dynamics and dynamics in direct service, right? Where people who've experienced trauma have been hurt by other people, right? And so to protect themselves, they vet the people they let in, right? There's mistrust there. We know as direct service professionals, we don't take that personally. And there are techniques we use to build trust, showing up consistently, being authentic, right? Not giving up on people. Eventually you can earn somebody's trust. But what happens in that process, which might take days, weeks, months, or years, is they weed out people who weren't really there for them, right? People who were not willing to put up the level of commitment necessary to earn their trust. And I can't say that that's a bad thing because they have to protect themselves. Now, we know that people who've experienced trauma have a sort of hyperactive threat detection system, and they will sometimes think somebody's a threat when they're not, and they might freeze that person out, right? And that can be harmful for sure. So zooming back out now to the community level, like when you talk to EDs of community-based organizations, and particularly CVI organizations, they all have stories of, getting promised funding and not getting it, have been giving the runaround of, the hell that we put organizations through to just get reimbursed for the work that they're doing, right? And when we look at philanthropy and we look at research institutions, we know that great harm has been done. So I think that's where we need to start, is just acknowledging like we are all stepping into, not into a vacuum, but into a long history. And so I say this to the philanthropists and the government professionals like I was: you inherit that harmful legacy. And you are not just an individual, but you are also a representative of that system. And that doesn't mean that you can't do any good. It means you have to accept that tarnished history, acknowledge it, and figure out, first of all, the onus of building trust is on you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you have the power and the resources, and you represent the institution that has caused harm. So you have to accept that responsibility. So if a community provider comes to a meeting and, cusses you out or acts in a way that you think is inappropriate, keep it rolling, right? Like, don't take that personally. Understand where that comes from. If you're going to do this work, you have to commit to this work. And that might be a multi-year, multi-decade journey. So then I think we need to develop methods for building trust and building partnership. And I don't think that's something that we're particularly good at. We see this within the CVI field and in other fields, right? We're trying to vet who's really about it and who's not. And we all probably have certain lists in our head of, I really mess with these people and I don't really mess with these people. But then we don't ever engage the second list and like try to work through that conflict or that discomfort, right? And there's a lot of elephants in the room when we bring philanthropists, government, researchers, community members, community organizations. When we have these sort of like multi-stakeholder settings, we don't always acknowledge those and figure out a way to move forward. And I don't have a perfect answer to that, but my answer is, let's start chipping away at that. And lastly, just to reiterate, like I put the responsibility for that on the people with power and resources, right? Because they're part of the institutions that have caused the harm. And so like now there's an opportunity to begin repairing that harm and moving in a different way. I guess I'll say one last thing, because something I see all the time is like leaders who have emerged in an environment where there's scarce resources have to develop a different playbook, right? They often have like a deep network of contacts that they can leverage. They have somebody they can call for just about everything. They're not afraid to call the media if they need to call the media, right? Because the systems were not responsive to them when they played by the rules. They figured out different rules, right? So now you have unseasoned government worker who's coming in and wants to do something, and they have great intentions. Their heart's in the right place. They're passionate. They want to do the right thing. And then this community member or community leader, moves in a way that they then take personally or feel uncomfortable with. And then their takeaway from that is, well, I don't know why people are doing this. It's so hard to work with them, right? And it's like, you have to understand the system isn't going to get fixed overnight, and people have adapted to harmful systems. And so even if you have the right intentions, you still have to be prepared for people to treat you the way they have learned to treat government. So appreciating where those behaviors have come from, because they have helped community leaders get resources for their people, keep their organizations afloat, and save lives in their community. And if you don't want people to power struggle with you, then you need to share power with them. You have to open up channels for them to share in or participate meaningfully in decision making, right? And if you're not doing that and you're just saying, hey, will you rubber stamp this plan that we came up with without consulting anybody? Well, then you're going to get what you're going to get.
Again, very powerful. One of the things, I just want to say this, and if it makes it in the show, it makes it in the show. If it doesn't, it doesn't. The other side of that, or a different side of that, there's also community leaders or people running organizations that just aren't in it for the right reasons. And they are manipulating the power that they have. It's speaking on behalf of a community and those who are very vulnerable and who they're supposed to be serving, but they don't necessarily speak for legitimately for that community. They aren't showing up with the best intentions for the field or those people. They're looking to line their pockets to elevate their status as being the hero in this narrative. And I have a problem with that. As a community person that went into systems in government, as a person, I've talked about my background. One of the biggest challenges I had was obviously fighting for people while being inside, fighting for community while being inside the system. The system in government bureaucracies are designed to protect the system and the bureaucracies. It's
Yeah.
quite fascinating when you look at it. Wow, this is a self-healing thing. And when you start to dismantle or disrupt that system on behalf of the community, well, actually, I'll go here. One of the other biggest problems I had was that because I moved as a community person into the system, I almost immediately lost some of my credibility with some people because they saw me as now a systems player. Because I now have a government badge and I get a check once a month from the state, or obviously I'm not community anymore. I took offense to that because it's like you have no idea what I'm fighting for or how hard these fights are. Anyway, that was
Yep.
a rant and a ramble. I want to go back to something that you said early on about understanding the issue. You really laid out the basic fundamentals of a public health approach. Understand what the issue is, who's being impacted the most, who is at the highest risk, and why, right? What are the root causes? And then having an understanding of what are the risk and protective factors that are leading the people or preventing people from being impacted by the issue as it's been defined, and then implementing or finding a strategy that they want to implement to address those risk and protective factors, and then evaluating it, right? That's a gross oversimplification of a public health approach. You talked about
That's
that
it.
and how that is necessary to be effective in this work. My question for you is how do we get both community-based organizations to understand the importance of each of those parts of the work, and not just community-based organizations, government systems need to understand also that you can't just say, "Oh, I want the Chicago model," or "I want." There has to be some work that's done beforehand to understand if even if that's the right model to bring into your city, your jurisdiction.
Yeah. That's tricky. I mean, a big piece of that, I think, is getting the right people in the right positions. We have dozens of offices of violence prevention at the city, county, and state level now across the country, and more starting, every month or year. And there are different types of leaders in those roles. And I think it's critical that we have leaders who have worked in CBI and understand the methods that we use so they can help guide those decisions. But I also know that those leaders are up against barriers because, they might get told, hey, we've got $3 million this year and you need to get it out the door ASAP. And they quickly design an RFP, and right, that's where I was joking earlier about little $75,000 grants. And I know $75,000 is a lot of taxpayer money, but when we think about what an organization needs to do this incredible work, that's not it. And, there's all these barriers around duration of funding, right? Like some jurisdictions, you can't even apply for funding unless you've been pre-approved, into a contractor's database. Other jurisdictions, you can apply, but it's federal pass-through funds, and you need a certain number registered with the federal government, and all these other requirements, right? Or you get the money, but it's a 12-month contract, but contract negotiation takes 3 months, so then you only have 9 months, and you have to hire staff, which takes another 3 months, and so you're talking about 6 months when it's supposed to be a year, right? These are all things that we can fix. And I think that that is a piece of it. But then when we think about how do we make sure that the work is rooted in sound methodology and a public health approach, I think it's really about taking the time to do the work and not looking for a quick fix. And I know that, our political windows of opportunity often come immediately after a crisis, right? Like Ready Chicago started because there were almost 800 homicides in Chicago in 2016. And that led to a bunch of private funders getting together to saying, this is unconscionable and we've got to do something about this, right? But it wasn't any less unconscionable when it was 500 murders. And we could have done something about it then, right? But it's this moment of crisis that spurs doing something differently. The problem is that in a moment of crisis, there's also a great urgency, and the urgency prevents us from slowing down and doing analysis. And so I think many leaders are pressed in a situation where they don't have the tools inside of the bureaucracy or the flexibility that they need to structure things the right way. And then there's also this urgency of find something that works and get it done. And, I'll just talk a little bit about work that I've supported. We started community safety councils across the state of Washington while I was with the Washington State Office of Firearm Safety and Violence Prevention. And the reason we did that was twofold. One is we wanted to make sure that any planning that took place was in partnership with community, right? And so we contracted with a lead organization for these councils, but they had to assemble a council that included direct service professionals, people with lived experience of firearm violence, government and or philanthropy, and others. And through these councils, the first thing that we had them do was partner with the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, NICJR, to analyze the violence in their region so we can answer those questions about who's most at risk, where is it happening, and why is it happening. So we structured out months and months and months, right? And during that same time, we're giving them trainings about what CVI is. And ultimately, they have to put together a violence reduction plan. But it's after doing all of the work to understand what's driving it. Because we also see across the country, a lot of the money that is supposed to go to community violence intervention, to directly serving people who are at the greatest risk, who are likely to be involved in firearm violence in the near term, meaning in the next couple of years, is actually going to violence prevention, right? It's going to zip codes that have risk factors inside of which some people will eventually become most at risk or become directly involved, right? But it's not going to programs that serve people. And we need violence prevention services. They're really critical. But there's other funding for violence prevention. So every dollar that comes out of a CVI budget and goes towards, a sweeping policy change or a violence prevention program is one less dollar that we have to save lives in CVI. We need all the dollars, but we also need to protect the CVI dollars, right? And so I knew from my position at the state, if we just put out a grant that said, hey, 6 regions we want to focus on, submit a violence reduction plan to us, they wouldn't have been set up for success to submit an effective violence reduction plan. So we had to actually structure that in, and build the time, bring in the expertise, and invest in them learning what CVI is and what public health methodology is, so that by the time we're asking them, hey, submit us a violence reduction plan, we've set them up for success and they can actually do it. So I just highlight that as an example of a lot of intentionality that went into that. And that's one example of how we can move more effectively.
Absolutely love that for a variety of reasons. One thing that you said there that really resonated with me was the fact that with the community safety councils, they were comprised of people from the community, and then also the systems players were also at the table. How did that demonstrate effectiveness in a way that was different from the way that the work has been built out previously?
I think the big thing that we did, and it takes ongoing support, right? I don't think you can rush into a model like this or just do it and expect it to work beautifully, because what ultimately happened is we surfaced existing tension in the community through the microcosm of the council, which I think is a good thing. It was admittedly challenging for some of the council leaders, but I think it's a good challenge, right? Because these dynamics exist whether we address them or not. And so within a council of 12, you would have tension around, are you just going to shove this plan down our throats? Or are you really listening to us? Because historically, you have not listened to us, right? And I think it's good to surface those tensions and work through that. Because if you don't, then what's going to happen is people are going to withdraw to protect themselves. Government still needs to do something. So then it's going to be the same old, right? And I think one thing we could have done better is created an actual model for conflict resolution and just trained everybody in that from the get-go. And I think this is something that we need to be doing within CVI organizations and within field building generally, is have actionable methods for what do we do when there's a conflict. Because what I have seen is when there's conflict, people retreat, right? They'll say, all right, I don't want to deal with that person, so I'm going to freeze them out. I'm just not going to deal with them. Or I'm going to, talk stuff about them behind their back. But we can solve a lot of these things. Right? We are in the field of conflict mediation, right? And so we have got to advance our methods for resolving conflict and repairing any harm that caused the conflict or came about through the conflict, right? So I think that's a piece of it. We gave, and again, this wasn't perfect, and there's a lot of things that I would do differently if I could do it again, but I think it was a really good start. We gave power to a bunch of different stakeholders, and they had to move together to make decisions about what they were going to do, right? One of the first things they had to do was create a charter for their council that says, how are we going to make decisions? And everybody had to participate in the creation of that charter. So now we have a governing document that everybody has had say in that guarantees that everybody continues to have a say, right? Again, I think the challenge of doing things that way is that it does take time and it takes a different level of investment. But I think that's the only choice. If you don't move in a spirit of true partnership, and it's not about intentions or talking about partnership, it's about actually sharing power in ways that are written down on paper and guaranteed, right? When you do that, and really what I'm talking about is democracy, right? When we involve people meaningfully in the decision-making process, it does take more time. However, the trade-off is so worth it, because if we don't involve people, then what we see is top-down approaches disconnected from the work, accidentally causing more harm than they're helping. What we have seen for years and years and years, and we don't need any more of that.
So, Soren, what I hearing very clearly is, it's a roadmap for disruption to kind of the status quo, the way our systems have traditionally worked, right? This is a blueprint to, again, disruption. What I hear in what you just said is there needs to be a commitment from community to learn the playbook for disruption, right? Like to demand power, to and if we want things to change, there has to be a shared power sharing. If we want things to be different, there has to be power sharing. But power, and I don't know the famous quote verbatim, but power is never
Doesn't give itself away.
Yeah, it never gives itself away,
Yeah.
right? And so,
Yeah.
in order to be able to demand power and have some legitimacy in that, you have to come up with receipts. You have to come with, look, this is the way that our community wants to address this issue. Here is the process in which we want to resolve this issue. Here's the science behind how we came to this process. Now, what are you going to do? Systems player. And what I mean by that, like, are you going to participate in this by helping provision resources, funding, technical assistance, and all of those things? Or, and that's where I get stuck here. Like, what's the or? What's if power doesn't want to play nice, where are we then?
Yeah, and power never wants to play nice. I think it's a few things. I think it's demanding power, whatever that looks like, advocating, lobbying, protesting. I think it's also building power through, for example, shout out to the Black and Brown Collective for Community Solutions to Gun Violence. I know you had Shawnee on recently. They have a mentorship program. A lot of folks in the CVI space, in the reentry space, and other spaces that serve people who've been marginalized by systems are investing in leadership and helping people build skills so that they can step up and demand that power. I think that's another lane that's critical. And then I think another piece of this is you talked earlier about moving into government and people looking at you and trying to figure out, are you our man on the inside? Or maybe wrongly thinking that you forgot where you came from. I think we need a lot of people on the inside, if that makes sense. Like this might be silly, but I have this idea that sustains me in these times of an invisible army, right? There's people like you in positions where they can maybe not snap their fingers and make things perfect, but they can influence decisions in the right way. We had Eddie Bocanegra in the White House. We have other people in state legislatures and leading offices of violence prevention, leading nonprofits, and we have people in philanthropy who have been directly impacted themselves and understand the work. Like, it's not everybody in all of those places, but in all of those places, there's somebody, and all of those people collectively, to me, are what I call the invisible army, like out there doing the work, trying to the greatest extent possible, like push these systems. And again, none of this is a perfect solution, but I think, if the invisible army is out there doing their work, we're trying to move things in the right direction. At the same time, those of us who have been fortunate to have people believe in us and invest in us and lift us up, and we now have the opportunity to pass that on, I think we need to be investing in the next generation of leaders and building them up so they can join the invisible army. And then all of us collectively together, through whatever means possible, demanding that we do this work in the most effective way possible. And it's not a perfect answer, but those are three levers that I see that we can all be pulling.
I'm over here chuckling because you almost have me regretting that I quit my job at the state. I need to keep. Hey, you guys hiring?
Well, you're doing meaningful work now. And I'll say I have a special respect for people who can stay in government for a very long time and work that system, because it moves very, very slowly. But we need those people. We need those dedicated people who are going to be around for years and decades without forgetting what the mission is.
I have obviously, because I experienced it, a tremendous respect for people with inside government. And let me got that with who are doing the work for the right reasons, who are looking to make sure that our systems that we pay taxes to provide for are doing just that. As a short aside, when I got hired to run the Office of Youth Violence Prevention for the city of Denver, like, that was really my first time working from a position of perceived power within the city and county of Denver, the government. And almost immediately, like, I got a splash of ice cold water in my face that I did not make it. Like, I thought I had made it, but almost immediately, because the city had actually allocated from general funds a budget for the office. Huge win. And part of that funding was supposed to go for a grant program. And in my mind, I'm compiling a list of the organizations that I know who are doing great work, and I'm going to be able to get that money into their hands, and we're going to save some lives immediately. And then I learned about the contracting process, and the bureaucracy around, like you said, it takes months and months and months to get a contract processed and signed and finalized, and that's cutting into the things. And mind you, we created the office in 2020, so we're in the height of COVID. The office officially launched in February 2021, so COVID is still a very much real thing. And there was this stipulation that, and once we got the grant, the RFP drafted, there was this crazy stipulation that the organization had to show up for this mandatory info meeting on a Zoom call. And as well as I know, that some of these organizations are one or two man shops. And there was a particular organization where nobody from the organization could show up for this mandatory info call that was being recorded, by the way, because the whole staff had COVID. And so then they were no longer eligible to apply for the grant. Crazy. There was other instances where, like, there was these stipulations that they had to participate in this youth violence prevention training course that I had never laid eyes on, right? Like, as the director of this office, I feel like I should be the one that's saying these are the stipulations, these are the requirements for somebody to be eligible, not somebody in some office of contracting. And it got to the point where I finally said, whether you work in contracting or procurement or whatever your role is within the city and county of Denver's government infrastructure, you play a role in safety. Because if you delay or if you deny funding to this organization that's providing a safe space for a young person to be on Friday night, and they're not able to provide that programming on Friday night when we know that young people that we're prioritizing are at the highest risk,
Yep.
then you could be responsible for somebody getting killed.
Yep.
And then they were like, "Whoa, that's dramatic." I'm like, but in the nuts and bolts of things, that's literally what your job is, to lessen the risk that somebody is
Right.
going to get killed. And didn't win me many friends like that. In the emotional weight of having to carry that burden and being that messenger
Yep.
was just so heavy that it just wasn't a very comfortable. The state was absolutely miserable. Anyway, so I appreciate you naming that. I want to shift to something because I talking and having this conversation with you.
Wait, can I add something to what you just said real quick?
Please.
I just appreciate you sharing that because like when I know that we see the faces of the people that we've lost and we carry that with us. And even though I work from home most days, I have like a very comfortable setup where I'm supporting other programs and I'm not doing direct service anymore. But I'm moving with an intensity that will never leave me because of the experiences I've had and the people who have impacted me. And we need people in positions of power, like you said, contracting departments and procurement departments, to feel that same intensity. And I'm not saying they need to experience the same trauma, but we need to share that intensity with them so that they can move as true partners.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I want to say about that is you asked earlier about lessons from Ready. Well, here's one of the greatest lessons of my career that I want to share with anybody who needs to hear it. Most of the time when people say no, they're trying to make their day easier. They're trying to protect their position or protect their power. And there's always a lever somewhere that we need to figure out what that lever is. So anytime somebody says, oh, no, we can't do X, I'll say, why? Oh, because it says so in the state codes or it says so in the policy manual. Okay, cool. Let's go pull it up. Show me the line. 90% of the time, it's not in there. 90% of the time, it's something sort of related that says like, oh, you need to be careful about this process. Not you can't explicitly do X. Like, okay, so I see how 20 years ago somebody read that line and said X is risky, so we're not going to do it. That doesn't mean we can't do it. And 10% of the time it does say you can't do X. Well, guess what? Laws and policies can be changed. So if we need to do X, let's get started. I had to leave state government because I started right before we discovered a $15 billion state budget deficit. And so since I was a relatively new hire, I didn't get to stick around. But before I knew that was going to happen, I kept saying, I don't care if this takes 10 years, 20 years. What needs to happen needs to happen. So let's get started. Some of these things, for example, we have to do reimbursement-based contracting in the state of Washington. And a lot of places have that same restriction. That's a legal requirement. But we can change that law, or there's other solutions we can figure out where like we can reimburse you for other deliverables at the start of your contract, like build out a staffing plan in a program manual, and then we'll reimburse you for that. But that gives you a chunk of money that you can then hire staff with until you get into the regular routine of billing for staff time. Anyway, I say all that to say, like, don't let people hoard power through being opaque. One thing we learn in direct service is you have to be able to stand on business. You have to have integrity. And if a person that you're serving comes up to you and says, no, that's BS, like why? You have to be able to answer that question. You can't be like, oh no, the policy says. They don't care. You have to be able to speak to the real reason we're doing things. And if there is a policy, you better stick to it. And we need to hold people in positions of power accountable to the exact same thing, even if they're, respectfully. And we also need to build relationships and trust with those people. And that'll help us move things along. But our bottom line has to be, to your point, saving lives, not, oh, a protocol says it, so we're going to follow the protocol. We got to follow it until we change it, but we can change it.
Spot on, brother. Yes. All of those stipulations, requirements that I talked about, after investigating, doing some of the due diligence of, okay, where is this rule coming from? I came to find out that it was actually one lady or maybe a couple ladies, but mostly one lady who felt like her position and power and influence in the world of youth, working with youth in the city of Denver, was being threatened by this new Office of Youth Violence Prevention. And again, as I mentioned, there was now $1 million that were coming from the general fund specifically for youth violence prevention. And talking with her, I don't know if this was her exact words, but she's like, I need to get my hands on that money for my programs. And a lot of her programs, almost all of her programs, were upstream primary prevention. And she rationalized it to say, I'm doing violence prevention because I'm funding this after school program that makes cookies in a neighborhood that has a higher rate of violence. And so
Right.
I'm doing violence prevention and I've been doing it for 20 years. Therefore, I deserve that money. In addition to that, she again didn't maybe articulate this outright, but her position was that if the Office of Youth Violence Prevention encroached on her work, then her work may eventually be eliminated, where she was not
Mhm.
able to see that there's very distinct different lanes. And she has a mortgage, she has kids in college, she has a car payment, she has all of these things that the system has provided for her. And I mean, it used to be before a couple of years ago, if you had a government job, you were pretty much protected from all of the instability of the private sector. And so she was working really hard to protect her job.
Yeah.
And that, when I talked earlier about like how kind of beautiful the system is, it's like that's the beautiful lie that they tell you. You protect the system, then we'll protect you. And so that was the fight that I don't think most people see when you come into government, that you're not necessarily fighting against the system, you're fighting against people protecting the system for their own personal
100%.
gain. Let me ask you this, and kind of related, and as we talk about how system dynamics are, and I talk about I talk about how there are agencies and subsystems within the larger system that are insulated and protected no matter what. We have traditional public safety, law enforcement, your police department, your sheriff's department, you have your fire department, you have like your emergency, your paramedics. Like there's always going to be a department that paves the roads. There's always going to be a parks and rec. There's always going to be these institutions within the larger institution. How do you see, whether it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, how do we work to get CVI as one of those institutions within the institutions? That, and not
Yeah.
to say that it needs to play by the bureaucracy, but that it's valued and prioritized for the value that it brings.
Yeah. I'm going to try to explain what I think, and we'll see if I can do this succinctly. You're hitting at something that I think is really critical, and I'll give you my sort of like big picture of how I view this. To me, you have CVI, and we need robust investment. We need to invest in the professionals doing the work. We need public health methodology, all these things that make CVI work. But CVI to me is a pillar of a broader ecosystem, which you just listed all the players who are in that community safety ecosystem, law enforcement, first response, alternative response, et cetera. And safety to me is like one and probably the most important foundational goal of a healthy society. And there are many other goals. And so when we zoom out from safety, to me, it's all about equity. And and I'm paraphrasing Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's all about impact. We should do A because it'll lead to B. We argue about it, we go one way or the other, and then we move on to the next thing. We never actually check if it led to B. Now, I mean, we have dedicated researchers and other thinkers who are checking, but the system itself doesn't care about impact. It only cares about making decisions and then moving on, which to me is insane. Because if we can demonstrate policy led to harm and it didn't produce the intended outcome, there should be a mechanism already baked in where we can go and take that policy back or change it in some way. So when I think about the systems that we need to have in place to create safe communities, to create thriving communities, we have to be measuring all of these things and holding people accountable to the outcome. So if we see incredible disparities, as we do by zip code, of who's being involved in gun violence and to what extent that a community is being impacted by gun violence, we need a strong policy response to activate that. So I want to say that because I think there's this bigger structural problem that obviously is very difficult to address. But one of the ways we can chip away at that is really thinking about impact and measuring impact and holding people accountable to impact. Then when you zoom into community safety specifically, I think that really it comes back to the trust conversation that we were having. And I'll draw a parallel here. When we talk about our struggles with compliance and procurement professionals, I will grant that there is a certain mindset that one develops through being in those roles. Folks tend to be very risk averse, whereas people like you and me are creative problem solvers. So we have a much higher risk tolerance because we're saying we know what the risk of doing nothing or doing it wrong is. That's the risk that communities are currently facing. So compared to that, I don't care if we have to move some rules around, try some new things, and it might not work out, but that causes us to butt heads with people who have a different professional mindset. And I'm going to slide back over to the community safety aspect. Law enforcement, fire, first responders, co-responders, alternative responders, community violence intervention professionals, we all have different professional mindsets. We look at the world differently. The work shapes the way that how we see problems and what we think the solutions are. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And to a certain extent, that's inevitable. But we have to understand, how each other thinks so that we can cross that hurdle and actually partner. And we need to put the right professions in the right places to do the right things. There's in the literature on alternative response, there's this phrase that gets used that is like, we need to get the right responder to the right type of call. And that's all it is. So going back to the impact piece, like what happens when you send an unarmed social worker to a behavioral health call? We've been doing it in several cities across this country, and it's been working really, really well. So that would seem to be the right responder to the right call. Okay, well, what data do we have that gives us an indication that there's a risk of community firearm violence? Let's get CVI professionals to that call. Let's get law enforcement to the calls that they're best at responding at. Let's divide all of this up because it's not about any one of these professions. It's about how do we know when harm is happening and what do we do about it? And the answer to what do we do about it is we have a bunch of different strategies based on how we've assessed the type of harm. And we're going to continue to monitor this whole thing and improve it over time. So I think we have to find ways to decenter all of these professions. It's not about any one of these professions being like the leader of community safety. We all do different stuff. We all solve different problems, and we need to work in concert, and we all need to be held accountable to outcomes.
Oh, love it, love it, love it. That's why I invited you onto the show, that you are not only capable, as you just demonstrated, at looking at the big picture, but then kind of reverse engineering to, okay, big picture is made up of a lot of systems. Those systems are made up of a lot of different processes, and those processes are created to respond to the research and the understanding of why such and such issue exists. Is that fair? A fair way to look at it?
Yeah, when things work well, and sometimes those systems or processes are random or were decided 30 years ago for some other reason. So it's a collection of reasons.
Yes, yeah. Well, where I'm going with this is your career trajectory from working in detention centers to working with Ready to working with the state of Washington to doing some consulting. You have something new here that you've recently launched called Our Power Collective. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And if my understanding of it is to help people understand the process of developing out the processes, right? To get to understand like these are the components that you need and like to develop fidelity. Talk more about what Our Power Collective is.
Yeah, and shout out to my business partner Raven Scott. She and I met doing CBI work in Allegheny County, and
shout out Cornell.
Absolutely. we had just started talking about like, man, what would it look like if we just did this on our own? And I don't mean without Allegheny, I mean without the other institutions that we were associated with. And what we realized is together we had, I think, some techniques that are really needed in the field, and also that we could do the work in a meaningful way. And so let me explain what I mean by both of those things. We're really focused on partnerships, programs, and people. And we've covered all those things in this conversation, so you know what I'm talking about. We need methodology for building effective cross-sector partnerships, for seeing each other as human, for building trust, and for repairing harm when it occurs, because that is the foundation upon which all this work is built. So we want to invest in those partnerships. We also need programs that are rooted in a strong understanding of what's driving violence and have been robustly developed so we can implement them consistently and measure them to see if they're having results. And none of this work happens without the people. And so we really want to invest in CVI professionals in two ways. One, in terms of building skills, and the other in creating healthy, healing work environments for them. You know, CVI professionals are 10 times more likely than other first responders to be killed on the job. CVI professionals experience great amounts of trauma before they even get on the job, are exposed to trauma on the job, and are getting secondary trauma from the participants that they're serving. So there's a triple threat of traumas that they face. And the organizations that they work for don't have the resources or time oftentimes to create a healthy healing environment for them. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do to make it so that being a CVI professional isn't something that continues to traumatize you and burn you out, but actually can be healing. And I know you're talking to Jaleel Meekins, shout out Philly, recently about, doing the healing before coming in the work, because the work is not healing. It's triggering and it's draining. And I agree that there's a threshold of healing that needs to be happened to be able to, like, because our tool in social work is ourselves. So like that tool has to be in good enough shape to be able to do the work. But I also think that what CVI professionals are experiencing today is typically very like top-down organizations where they don't have a say. And I'll just use that as one example. We know in providing trauma responsive services to participants, voice and choice is really, really important. You don't tell participants what to do. You partner with them, help them explore their options, help them figure out, follow their own compass for who they want to be, but you support them in that journey. But then when we look at our organizations, it's like our workers don't have much say in what happens. That's just as one example. So if we really want to create healing spaces for participants, we also need to create healing spaces for staff. And just one example of how to do that is to level out hierarchies and share power. So I share that as just one example of we want to support people, building skills, and having healthy work environments. And lastly, one of the things that we're doing to support skills is we have an online learning platform called Our Power Academy, where a lot of the best practices and techniques we've been talking about, we're trying to create engaging, short, impactful courses where folks can learn these best practices. And then, of course, if we're partnering directly with a program, we're going to come in and do live practice and go a lot deeper and provide a lot more resources. But this online learning platform really provides like a solid foundation for how to do CDI.
That's amazing. I love that. And you just reminded me as you were talking, the core element of the work that I think more people are talking about it now, but probably still not enough about the need to be intentional about healing or making healing spaces for people doing this work. I know we do that often with, for example, police officers, firefighters, when they are exposed to trauma, traumatic scene, whether it's they were the witness of a horrific whatever it was. There's often police departments partner with a therapist organization to make sure that there's somebody there to respond. I have not seen that consistently in the field of CBI. I say consistently. There are some spaces that are doing it and doing it well. And I think it goes back to what we were saying previously about if we're going to make CVI an institution within an institution, that needs to be one of the core practices. How do we treat the field? How do we treat the people who are doing the work? How do we support them is a better way to say that. How do we support the people who are doing the work so that they don't burn out and then everything fails? I always think back to, let me just say this real quick. I think back to, again, that story that I opened with where Shamar got killed. if there have been, if was a fifth, but if I had had some support when Shamar died, then the trajectory of my life would be vastly different. Instead, I self-medicated, started smoking weed and drinking again and doing all of those things. So go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I think there's an opportunity there to do some of that cross sector trust building that we have been talking about, because we know all of the professions within the community safety ecosystem are exposed to more trauma than the average profession. I was in a training recently for behavioral health for first responders to help them respond to behavioral health calls. And one of the like modules in the training was on assessing suicidality. And a heavy emphasis in the training was we're not just talking about suicidality of people on the calls you respond to, we're also talking about your colleagues. And they essentially asked people to share. I don't remember if folks raised their hand or they were just sharing anecdotally, but talk about a time when you had to use these techniques with a coworker. And every single person in that room had a story of a coworker expressing suicidal ideation. And so we know that profession and all these professions are at tremendous risk. And you can look at the disparate suicide rates of law enforcement professionals and other first responders to see that. And so we all need healing, not just because all human beings deserve to be healthy and healed, but because we also need to be healthy and healed to do the work effectively. And that's also going to impact how we build community with each other and how we reach across the aisle. And since we have the shared experience, I think it's also a shared opportunity to come together and do some of that healing together. And that's one of the ways that we can build bridges to try to have that community safety ecosystem that we dream of.
Yeah. I'm so grateful that you agreed to come onto the show. Well, Soren, I titled the show The Incredible Messenger very intentionally because when I came up with the idea of the show, I really wanted to bring people on the show who I see in the field sees as credible for the work that they're doing and being able to bring a message to those who need to hear it in order to advance the field and grow the field and save lives, quite frankly. So at this point, obviously, from everything that you said, you have demonstrated why I view you as a credible messenger. I want to allow you the opportunity to share if a message that you have for anyone who is listening to the show.
Well, first, let me say I'm grateful also that you invited me. I really, really appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed this conversation as well. And I know that we're going to have many more conversations off camera after this. So I appreciate you. I mean, I would have two messages. One is to the CVI professionals who are doing this work. Like, you are what we need, and you are not getting everything that you need. And I know you're going to keep doing the work, and we are all going to partner to keep doing the work to get you what you need so that you can do this. You deserve a space in the community safety ecosystem. We cannot create safety in communities without credible messengers, without people with lived experience in the community, bringing resources, building connections, and building healing. It's so, so vital. And so that invisible army that we're all a part of, like, we're going to keep doing our thing and making sure that we get to where we need to go. And to that point, my second thing that I would say is to anybody, like, we can have the world that we want to have, that we deserve. Right now, there are a small number of people who have way too much power who are making that impossible, but that's temporary, right? Like, we named our organization Our Power because we believe that we have the power to create safety and to create the world that we want to live in. And I really, really believe that. And we can't let the barriers that are in front of us, especially right now, prevent us from imagining the world that we want to live in, because things can look impossible until 10 seconds before they happen. And so we have to preserve our optimism and also understand, like, this is what I tell myself to get through these times is like, when people look back on this time in 50 years or 100 years, I want them to talk about the way that we maneuvered and persevered and got creative and overcame, right? Not the ways that we got beaten down and gave up. I think if we maintain our optimism and our creativity and our fight, there's nothing that we can't overcome. It might take years, it might even take decades, but we can get there. And we owe that to the future generations to create real safety for all of our communities.
Love that. I love that. What I am taking away from at least partially what I'm taking away from that is we are working for the change that we may not be around to see. This is a long fight, right? And that sounds cliche. People say it all the time. And the truth of the matter is we didn't get here overnight. And there is no overnight solution. There is no quick fix to this. And that we need to stay committed, stay strong, and know that we have each other's back. There's a strong community in this. Man, Soren, thank you so much for being on the show. How can people get a hold of you and get in touch with you if they want to learn more about you, your work, if they want to Our Power Collective, all of those things?
Yeah, check out www.ourpower.org, OURPOWER.org. You can also find me on LinkedIn. If you just look up Soren Tsui, I think I'm the only Soren Tsui in the world, SORENTSUI. Check it out. You'll see the work that we're doing, and there's options on the website too for getting directly in touch with us. And thank you, Jonathan, man. This has been an incredible conversation. I really, really, really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I appreciate you again agreeing to be on the show and just having this conversation with me. And if you, the listener, if you made it to this part of the show, obviously there was something valuable, there was something interesting that you heard that resonated with you. I'm going to challenge you to share it with somebody else. If you're a community leader, share it with your colleagues, share it with your team, share it with somebody. If you work within the systems and you're like, ooh, what? I have never thought about it this way. Share it with your colleagues, share it with your boss, your supervisor, your manager, share it with your mayor. Let people know that this is what the Incredible Messenger show is, that we're bringing value to help you, not selling you anything. We're here to help you, and we're here to help you help others. So with that said, man, I've rambled too much all through this episode, so I appreciate you.
Me too.
I appreciate y'all. We'll be back next week with another dope episode. I'm out of here. Peace.